Dr. Heidi Schreiber-Pan is the clinical director at the Chesapeake Mental Health Collaborative, former affiliate professor of pastoral counseling at Loyola University, and author of the book Taming the Anxious Mind. Heidi specializes in the integration of faith and clinical counseling. As an educator, she offers a unique blend of faith-based practices and psychosocial theories of well-being, and her research in the field of resilience and psychological well-being has informed her clinical work extensively. Dr. Schreiber-Pan has worked with numerous area faith communities to increase well-being by equipping individuals with tools for living a resilient life. Heidi lives with her husband of 20-plus years, her 2 teenage boys, and her lovable dog, Coda, in northern Baltimore County. The family spends most of their free time enjoying the outdoors, mostly hiking and camping throughout the U.S.
Hello, everybody. I feel very grateful to be invited to speak at the Catholic Women Conference of Maryland. And what a wonderful topic, made for joy. I'm going to start us off with a beautiful scripture reading from Psalm 94:19 that says, "When anxiety was great within me, your consolation brought me joy." So those two, anxiety and joy, is going to be my part today to speak to you about. So my name is Heidi Schreiber-Pan, and I want to start with a personal story of what happened when I still lived in Germany. So I grew up in the German Alps, and my father was a mountaineer. And one of our favorite activities that we would do in the summer and in the winter is go into the mountains. So I grew up a little bit like in The Sound of Music. So I moved to the U.S. and I missed that activity. And one day I planned a trip back. And it was in August, and we went to climb a very high mountain in the Italian part of the Alps called the Dolomites. So on that trip to the top of that mountain, we hit every weather possible, and it was August. We hit snow and rain and ice. There was some sunshine too. But when we got to the very top, there was a hut where we were going to spend the night. And the innkeeper told us that weather was moving in, a deep fog, and we were not going to see the next morning the sunrise. I was very disappointed, as I've come all this way to see this amazing view. And also note that that was a time in my life when I've experienced a lot of doubt. Doubt the existence of God, and doubt around the purpose that I was here for. And so I went to bed that evening, and I said a little prayer. I said, "God, if you exist, can you make sure that there's going to be a beautiful sunrise tomorrow morning?" So I woke up the next morning, and there was not a cloud in the sky. I walked from that hut to the very top of the mountain, and the view that greeted me that morning removed all doubt for me that there was a benevolent force called God that was going to be part of my life. And in that moment, I also made a pact that my professional life would in some way help people with their suffering through the closeness of God and also through a relationship with the natural world. So I walked down that mountain, and I walked right into Loyola's pastoral counseling program, where I got my PhD in helping people bring together their spiritual resources, their faith traditions, and helping them with their suffering, specifically anxiety. So when we're looking at experiencing God's joy, which is what this conference is speaking to, let's look at a few obstacles to experiencing God's presence or God's joy. So one of the things that I would like to talk to you about is really stress and anxiety as an obstacle to experiencing God's presence and God's joy. So I want to give a little metaphor of what that might look like. So we're in October, and perhaps this summer you and your family went to the beach somewhere. And let's say you were in the water. You're in the water and there's a wave coming, and you realize that's a pretty big wave. What are your options? Well, one of your options is to dive under the wave. If you've ever done that, you realize that as soon as you dive under, and whatever happens on the surface, you can come right back up, and the harsh part of the wave has now passed you. Or if you've ever done scuba diving or snorkeling, as soon as you go under the surface, it becomes quiet. And there's a calm underneath the water. Okay, so this is one option, is to go under the water. Let's say there's another option. Let's say you want to ride it out. So sometimes you see this on the beach. Kids will stand there and they try to time it just right. They catch the wave. Maybe they got a little boogie board. And with the right tools, they catch their wave and they ride it to the shore and they jump up and they say, "Did you see that? That was amazing." So that's another option. We can ride it out. What some people do is they see this wave coming and they become very tense, and they start becoming tense and they just kind of go like this, and then the wave really starts kind of hurting them and they sort of crumble in some way. So that's really this idea of the storm coming. The wave, a storm, what are our options? We can go under the surface, and that's going to be our metaphor for finding the peace that's below the surface, that can be found through meditations or prayer when we rest on the presence of God. So when we ride it out, there are storms in life, crises, such as the death of a loved one or job loss. And when these crises happen, all we can do is really go from 1 minute to the next. And those times we just have to ride it out. With the support of a church community, with the support of your faith, you usually are able to ride these crises out. Now, sometimes what happens at the beach is a lifeguard will tell everyone that there's a riptide out in the ocean and that we have to be really careful about avoiding that section. But what the lifeguard will usually say is, hey, if you do get caught up in the riptide, make sure that you don't struggle. Just let that water pull you out a little bit further, because then it will release you. You swim parallel and back into the shore. And so that idea is that there is these boundaries that we have to set. There's certain boundaries where we know we do not go, or certain areas that we want to protect in our life. New Living Translation, John 14:27. I'm leaving you with a gift, peace of mind and heart. And the peace I give you is a gift the world cannot give. So don't be troubled or afraid. So Jesus speaks of the gift of peace, the peace of mind and heart. So let's look at 3 pathways that can lead to the peace that Jesus promises us. The first pathway is what I call quieting the monkey mind. So we have roughly around 50,000 separate thoughts each day. Many of them ruminate on the same thing, such as worrying. So I want you to imagine that we have this monkey in our mind that is just constantly jumping from one branch to the other. Unfortunately, a lot of the thoughts that we tend to ruminate on are more negative, and they are more on the problems that have not been solved. So when you wake up at 2 in the morning, the mind usually says, well, I'm glad you're awake because we need to get to some problem solving here. And you think, it's 2 in the morning. I don't want to problem solve right now. But since you're awake, let's get to it. So you have a mind that the nature of the mind is always trying to problem solve or is interested in the negative, things that are not going right with your life. And so we have all these thoughts, and they're often very negative. And so when we're talking about a pathway to the peace that Jesus promises us, it's really the first step is to quiet the monkey mind. And quieting and directing the mind towards God. Meditation or quiet prayer is the simplest form, and it's prayer in which you still your thoughts and emotions and you focus on God. So I want to give us this beautiful scripture verse called Philippians 4:8, and it says, finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable. If anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. Whatever you have learned or received or heard from me, or seen, put it into practice, as the God of peace will be with you. So that scripture verse talks about directing the mind to things that are pure or good or admirable. So when is the last time that you went through a day where you were able to let your mind rest on all those things? If you're anything like me, you can't remember the last day that that was possible. But I want to give you a story that really does a great job illustrating the nature of the mind and what our agency is behind letting the mind rest on God or on the anxieties and worries. And the story goes this way. The story comes out of the Native American tradition and talks about an elder who sits with his grandson. And the elder says to the grandson, "Son, I wanted to tell you I have two wolves sitting inside of me. One wolf is evil and resentful and angry and frustrated and unhappy and can't find joy. But I also have another wolf that lives inside of me, and that wolf is joyful and happy and compassionate and kind." And the grandson looks at the grandfather and says, "But if you have these two wolves and they fight, which one wins?" And he says, "The one that I feed." And so we have to remember every thought that we entertain, the company that we hold, the way that we spend our resources, right, are going to feed either one of these two wolves, because all of us have both of these wolves inside. Now, a thought popping into your mind, we've all had this, right? This strange thought pops into your head. And what you do next, that is up to you. That original thought, you can't really control that. But what you can control is say, I am not going to spend time entertaining this thought. I'm going to delete it, send it directly to the spam folder. Because what you direct your thinking on is going to affect the way you feel. And then it will affect the way you behave. So we have this filter system in our mind that's thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. And if you allow the mind to rest on things that are good and beautiful, things that you're grateful for, things that are going well in your life, if you direct your mind on that, your feelings are going to fall in line with that. You're going to experience joy and happiness. So we talked about this idea of quieting the monkey mind as one pathway to peace. And I will say it takes consistency. And it's a practice that we really have to do on a daily basis. There's a beautiful practice called centering prayer that really takes about 10 minutes a day where we focus on a scripture verse, or we can focus on an image for God or a name for God. And we just consistently bring that back to mind. So we can use centering prayer as a form to actually quiet the monkey mind. Pathway number 2 is what I call let go and let God. So when we remember Ecclesiastes 3, that talks about there is a time to weep, there is a time to laugh, there's a time to mourn, and there's a time to dance, a time to be silent and a time to speak. So Ecclesiastes instructs us that there is a time for everything. It doesn't mean that we always should experience joy and happiness. It means that there are times in our life when we have to mourn. And then there are times in life when we get to be joyful. What I often see in my work are people holding on to having to be happy. And then when a difficult emotion arises, they are not equipped to really cope with that. And they want to go and fix it and get rid of it. So I'll give you an example of that. Thanksgiving is coming up. And let's say you're hosting Thanksgiving at your house. You set your beautiful table and family members are coming in. And let's say that you have one family member that you love but is a little hard to like. So let's say you have one family member that tends to be a bit obnoxious, okay? But nevertheless, they're a family member and they're allowed to sit at your table at Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving lasts one day, perhaps another day, and then you don't really have to deal with this family member perhaps until Christmas. But let's say one of these family members is your anxiety. And let's say that instead of not allowing it a seat at your table, that you would allow it to be here. Giving it permission to be here, just like we're giving permission to all the other family members. Let's say that anxiety is an internal family member, along with joy and happiness, right? Everyone gets a seat at the table. When we stop fighting the anxiety and we stop trying to figure out how to fix it all the time, and we say, I allow you to be here, there's a reason for you to be here, it actually tends to dissipate quicker and more naturally so. So this idea of letting go of trying to fix it or focusing on how to get rid of it, and perhaps allowing it to be here, trusting that God will come alongside you and help you cope with it. So what do we want to let go of? We want to let go of worrying. Well, you might say to me, well, that's easier said than done. Well, I want to give you a few tools because I know the way that the mind works. So one way to really help the mind let go of worry is a couple of action steps. So one thing I want to ask you to do is create worry time. You can have a 10-minute worry session in the morning, and let's say you tend to worry a lot, and you need a second one in the evening. And the way that worry time looks is you do 10 minutes in the morning and 10 minutes in the evening. During those two times, you are allowed to worry as much as you want. Let it all out. Everything you can imagine about, just worry, worry, worry. Then your smartphone goes off to tell you 10 minutes are up. And in that moment, you finish up your worry time and you go on with your day. Let's say it's 2 p.m. in the afternoon and a worry pops into your mind. But what you want to do is gently remind yourself that this is not worry time. You thank the mind for bringing this to your attention and that you will get to that worry when the 8 p.m. worry time arrives. So what I've noticed, what clients have told me is when 8 p.m. arrives, that worry that seemed so important at 2 p.m., we don't really even remember what it was. The other thing that people often report is they don't even need 10 minutes. They worry and worry and worry, and they kind of run out of worry around 5 minutes into their 10-minute worry time. The reason we want to do worry time is we really want to limit the amount of worry we do. And we are actually able to do some instructing to the mind. You don't have to do everything the mind wants you to do. We can start taking agency and we can start managing the mind. Just like the instructions were, rest the mind on what's good and pure. If God thought you couldn't do that, He wouldn't have instructed you to do that. So be aware that you really can do that. Remember the 2 a.m. wake-up call for the mind that wants you to problem solve? Imagine it's a 5-year-old daughter that comes into your bedroom and says, hey mom, hey dad, it's 2 in the morning, can we play? What do you say to your daughter? No honey, it's 2 in the morning, this is not the time to play. You can't force your daughter to fall back asleep, but you can say, listen, I'm going to put some music on for you to pay. You can do that, you can read your book, but we're not playing at 2 in the morning. Don't allow the mind to problem solve at 2 in the morning. That is not the time to problem solve. It's 2 in the morning, you can't force yourself to sleep. Rest the mind on other things. Use it as a time to practice a visualization technique, to listen to soft music, or use that time to pray. So we talked about quieting the monkey mind. We talked about letting go and letting God, passing that on. And then we want to talk about staying present. The mind that is anxious is very happy to spend most of its time in the future. What if? What if this is going to happen? And what if, so I need plan A, B, and C, because if worst case is going to happen, I'm not going to be able to handle it without a plan. Now, You might have experienced the what ifs, and then you have the right side of your brain, which is the right hemisphere, that brings up all the imagery and pictures of worst case scenario. So the next thing you know, you're inside of a nightmare or horror movie, and none of which has actually happened. And yet, your body doesn't know that it's not actually happening. And that before you know it, you're in fight or flight and experiencing all this angst related to what if and worst case scenario. Mark Twain said his life was filled with many terrible, horrible events, most of which never happened. So we want to talk about how do we anchor in the present moment. So I understand, I'm a clinical director and I know I have to plan for future events and I have to learn from the past. But the way I like to look at it is I anchor in the present moment and I visit the future and I visit the past. But I solidly anchor in the present moment. Your senses are a wonderful way to bring you always back to the present moment. Because the sounds and the smells and the way your body feels, they're all bringing you information about just this moment, the present moment. Be still and know that I'm God. Such a beautiful verse from Psalms. And it really talks about being still and knowing that I'm God. And that grace of God is available in the present moment only, not in the what ifs. God doesn't live in that space. God lives in the now. So if worst case scenario really happens, it feels so much more overwhelming in the mind because God's not in that. God's going to be there in the present moment. So let's review the pathways that we've talked about so far. Quieting the monkey mind, letting go and letting God, and staying in the present moment. And now let's talk a little bit about healthy boundaries. And for that, I would like to read a quick story from my book, Taming the Anxious Mind, about setting boundaries. Perhaps you're familiar with the well-known story from the New Testament about the Good Samaritan. Luke 10:26 says, "He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring oil and wine on them. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. The Good Samaritan said, 'Look after him,' he said, 'and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have.'" But let's imagine there's a part 2 to this familiar tale. As the Good Samaritan, aka Sam, is about to leave, the injured person wakes up and slowly takes in the situation and begs to have a word with Sam. "You aren't leaving me, are you?" asked the injured person. "Well, I have to go and look after my family now. But I have bandaged your wounds, the inn is paid for, and I will reimburse the inn for any extra expenses." "And I thank you for all of that. However," the injured person says, "I still need you right now. I am not well. As you can see, please stay longer." Sam starts to think about it. He really needs to depart right now. His family is already waiting for him. Not to mention his business has suffered from his absence. Noticing the Good Samaritan's hesitancy, the injured man continues, "I am still hurting and in pain here, and you're thinking about leaving? It's just so selfish of you." "Well, I don't want to be selfish," thinks Sam. Thus, I decide to stay. Not long after his decision to stay, Sam experiences a new emotion, resentment. So boundaries often come into play when we have given more than we are able to give, and we have the emotion of resentment that follows through. Healthy boundaries are knowing what you're responsible for and knowing what you're not responsible for. Healthy boundaries are about saying no so that you can say yes to your own needs. It's often misunderstood for selfishness, but it's really self-care we're looking for here. And our last pathway that we're going to talk about today, last pathway to experiencing joy and peace, is the pathway of self-compassion. Ephesians 4:29 says, "Do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen." So when we talk about do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, I'm encouraging you to think about your own self-talk. Because self-compassion says, treat yourself with the same kindness and love that you treat people that are your friends or your family members. And what I find is people with anxiety, what can be really helpful is if we bring compassion to our experience and not allow the criticizer to always look for ways to put us down. We all have this internal voice that often jumps to the opportunity to cut us down. And so positive self-talk, the talk that you would give to a friend that needs your compassion and your kindness, try turning that to yourself. So a mindful Christian, I want to give you the acronym BOLD. A mindful Christian is bold. The B stands for breathing deeply. When we're caught up in anxiety, our body is tense, and what can help release that is taking few deep breaths. In fact, trying the 4-7-8 breath, breathing in on 4, holding 7, and exhaling 8. So deep, full breaths. The O stands for observing. So we want to observe the unhelpful thinking, the unhelpful stories that the mind is producing. If they're unhelpful to you, consider simply deleting them. The L stands for letting go and letting God. And the D stands for dedicating some time to your spiritual self-care. Self-care includes setting boundaries, as we've talked, and many times throughout the Gospels, Jesus retreated from everyone else to rest alone or to pray for himself. So I thank you for giving yourself that time at this conference to care for yourself. And I hope that these tips that we talked about, these pathways to experiencing peace and joy, are going to help you manage stress and anxiety in a more wholesome way. Thanks, everybody.
Welcome back, everyone. We're going to do a little bit of a question and answer session. Since I don't have a live audience, I thought maybe it would be helpful to have a few questions that usually come up answered for you in this segment.
So Heidi, thank you. That was really, really helpful and lovely, informative. So here's my question for you. I always wonder with people when they talk about a topic, how, do you struggle with anxiety? You're the head of a big mental health collaborative. You have a lot of things going on in your life. You're a PhD, you're a mom, a wife, everything that's happening, COVID. Like, do you struggle with anxiety? And if you do, how do you manage that for yourself?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I will say that if we don't have anxiety at all, we're probably not alive. So everybody has some anxiety. Some people, it becomes unmanageable. And I will say that for me, in order to keep it manageable, my coping really is all things that have to do with being outside in nature and hiking and walking with my dog. And I've noticed that when I'm all keyed up after a 15-20 minute walk outdoors, I can just tell the difference I'm in my mind and in my body. And so we at Chesapeake Mental Health, we do a lot of nature-based work because I know I'm not the only one on this planet that finds solace in nature. And so we actually do a lot of nature-based mental health work for people.
So my question to you is, when you talk about self-care and self-compassion and taking care of yourself, what comes up for me is, that feels really selfish. That feels like I'm as a Christian, I'm supposed to be always giving. How do you relate that to being compassionate with oneself and living as a Christian?
Yeah. I think that it has to do with being the best version of yourself. And if you're burned out, and if you're only giving, and you're not receiving, you are now being not the best version of yourself. Your fuse is short, you're irritable, because you just can't do it all without replenishing. One thing that really stuck with me is when I started doing a sitting practice, a mindfulness practice, just following my breath and centering prayer and focusing on a scripture verse. One of the teachers once said to me, picture all the people in your life that are going to come in contact with you today, because those are the ones that are going to benefit from your practice of sitting. And that helped me a lot. I was like, okay, because there's a part of me like, I don't really have time for this. I have a million things to do and da-da-da. But then I realized that my loved ones and my colleagues are going to benefit from me sitting here for 15 minutes, following my breath and asking for God's presence in my life. Doing a little meditation or a centering prayer. The ones that I love the most are going to benefit the most from me doing that. That helped.
So the other thing I'm curious about is with monkey mind. You talked about that. How do we train our mind? Because people that have anxiety, I think they would love to be able to not have monkey mind. But in some ways, they're kind of used to it, and it like somehow feeds them. And so, who am I without my monkey mind? So how do you transition?
Yeah. You transition with baby steps. Baby steps, right? So some people will say, it's overwhelming just to close my eyes for 60 seconds and focus on, let's say, the image of God or peace or breath. And so we talk about, okay, how about 10 seconds? Can we do 10 seconds? Can we look at the flame of a candle, right? So we're going to find a way to bring it to such easy steps that we can start. And knowing the judgmental nature of the mind is going to be like, see, you can't meditate. Your mind is obviously too busy. That's for these other people. And I'm here to tell you, we're all like that. All of our minds are too busy. It's hard for everyone to start when we start sitting down and doing these kind of contemplative practices. So one of the things that can be really helpful for people of faith, and this is coming directly out of the Ignatian spirituality. So Ignatius used to talk about using your imagination to be part of your prayer, right? So what we can do when we start these contemplative practices is using the visualization of Christ being there right with you, sitting with you and meditating, and his presence helping you calm down. And that visualization, using imagery and visualization can be extremely helpful.
Is there anything that you've found? You've written this beautiful book, Taming the Anxious Mind. It's been so helpful for so many people. Is there anything that you would say to a beginner? Like, here's kind of some first steps for dealing with anxiety.
Yeah, I think one of the first steps to do is to start a contemplative practice. And that's one of the steps we talked about, is to still the monkey mind and to be present. So if you start a contemplative practice, which could be centering prayer or meditation, it could be as simple as just taking a walk, but being really mindful of walking. Because sometimes when you go for a walk, the mind goes, ooh, great time for problem solving. So what are our problems again? So we want to not do that. We want to do our walk in a contemplative way. If anyone out there has done the walking of a labyrinth, that can be also a beautiful practice, a contemplative practice. Just slowly starting and following the labyrinth and sort of untangling that mind. But there are also a lot of great apps out there where people can start. Headspace is a good app for just 10 minutes a day. It helps you stay present and just sort of check in with your body and notice where there's tension, and maybe bringing some ease to the body and helping the mind focus on the breath. Calm app is wonderful for people that struggle with sleeping. So it has special music and stories helping you unwind at the end of the day. So technology actually can be, interestingly enough, can be helpful in this practice.